During the 2022 World Cup, the lights surrounding the stadium suddenly dimmed, and a huge wormhole appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the field. A powerful shockwave spread out, causing the tens of thousands of spectators on site to stir, and even the players stopped in their tracks. From the wormhole, a group of mysterious soldiers slowly emerged, descending from the sky. Fully armed, they appeared on the World Cup field, leaving players, spectators on site, and viewers in front of the TV utterly astonished. The last to come out was a female Special Forces soldier. LT Hart signaled for everyone not to panic, stating they were not enemies. In front of a global live broadcast, she announced an important message. We have traveled through a wormhole from 30 years in the future to the present day. In 30 years, Earth will be invaded by an alien species known as the White Spikes, creatures akin to the mythological Tautai. These monsters have an insatiable appetite, reproduce rapidly, and feed on flesh, whether human or animal. The monsters are unstoppable and invincible. In just 2 years, the entire world succumbed, and humans were reduced to only 500,000 people, still desperately resisting, at the brink of life and death. The future of humanity had no choice but to use time travel to come to their ancestors' present, calling on all countries to start preparing now to jointly resist those alien beings. If you do not help, within 6 months, human civilization will vanish from Earth. You are our last hope. Following this, governments around the world confirmed this speech and began constructing time travel facilities worldwide, sending soldiers from various countries to the future battlefield to fight the White Spikes. However, due to the overwhelming strength of the alien creatures, almost no one who went to the future to fight could return alive, showing that relying solely on soldiers was not enough. Consequently, countries around the world began to conscript civilians into the army, from all walks of life, regardless of gender or age. As long as they were physically able, they would receive a draft text, but even so, they still could not turn the tide of the future battle, and more civilians never returned. Pessimism began to spread, and the momentum of the anti-war movement grew stronger. Riots and protests erupted worldwide, with many questioning the relevance of a future war to modern people and why they should participate in a war that has not yet occurred. Some people were passive and negligent, believing in the inevitability of future failure. As a result, governments began selecting civilians who met the criteria for time travel. Dan Forrester, the male protagonist, had been a soldier before becoming a teacher after his discharge. One day, while teaching a class, he suddenly received a draft message, instructing him to immediately go to a military medical center to verify his eligibility for time travel. Upon arrival, he was asked to undress and was forcibly strapped to a chair. The personnel activated a futuristic device, and Dan Forrester extended his arm into the machine, which listed all the information of his life, revealing he had only 7 years left to live, perfectly meeting all the criteria for time travel. The reason for setting this condition was to prevent a time paradox. All soldiers sent 30 years into the future had to be individuals who would already be dead by 2052, ensuring they would not meet their future selves. Similarly, individuals who traveled from the future were those not yet born in this era, which did seem to make some sense. Dan Forrester was shocked to learn about his death in 7 years. He wanted to know how he died, but the other party did not want to answer, and simply proceeded with the process. When Dan Forrester withdrew his hand, his arm had a new piece of armor. The staff told him it was a time travel device equipped with communication and tracking systems, capable of sending him to the future and bringing him back to the present. It could only be removed after completing his military service. All participating soldiers were promised $1 million in compensation in case of death. However, if someone removed the device to desert, they would face severe imprisonment. Their spouse or children would be obligated to continue the battle in their stead. Dan Forrester could only go home to say goodbye to his wife and daughter. His wife opposed him going to the future to fight, considering it a nearly certain death, and suggested the family flee, understanding the consequences for his family if they fled. Dan Forrester decided to join the fight no matter what and promised his daughter he would return alive. After saying goodbye to his family, Dan Forrester quickly reported to the recruit base. Most soldiers traveling to the future for support were middle-aged or even older, having never used firearms. Among them, however, were professional mercenaries, with eyes full of killing intent. who had crossed over to fight the monsters 3 times and returned alive each time. LT Hart informed everyone that the military service would last only 7 days. If they were lucky enough to survive after 7 days, the device on their hand would automatically transport them back to modern society. Dan Forrester and his group were originally scheduled for 7 days of training before the battle. However, due to an emergency, the future world's only remaining alien research laboratory was under attack by the white spikes. Losing that laboratory was unthinkable. So the military had no choice but to send this group of rookies, who had received no training and had no understanding of the alien creatures, into the future. Dan Forrester adjusted his mindset, watching as the time machine activated. Electrical currents gradually converged above them into a marvelous domain, opening a massive spatial wormhole. The wormhole would transport them to a beach, 3 meters above the ground, preventing them from being killed by the fall. As the countdown finished, waves of recruits were stretched and sucked up one by one, emitting cries of pain. However, when it was Dan Forrester's turn, an accident occurred. A worker realized she had entered the wrong coordinates, and it was too late to stop the process. They were transported to a dangerous urban area. Tens of thousands of soldiers were sucked into the wormhole, all transported into the sky at a height of 100 meters and rapidly fell. Soon, the scene was filled with screams of horror. The majority of the soldiers died on impact, a sight too gruesome to behold. Fortunately, there was a swimming pool on a rooftop. Dan Forrester and others fell into it, narrowly escaping death. Dan Forrester climbed out of the pool, immediately checked his weapon for damage, and then surveyed the surviving team members. They hadn't even encountered the monsters yet, and already many were dead. As the expeditionary force looked upon the future world before them, their hearts sank further. The entire city was in ruins, resembling a hell on earth. The roars of the monsters and the screams of people were still vividly audible. Through a telescope, they witnessed a soldier who miraculously survived a fall only to be instantly killed by some sort of monster, a sight that fills them with despair. At that moment, a female commander makes contact, informing them that the city has been overrun by monsters and that a carpet bombing operation will soon commence. Before the bombing, they are tasked with rescuing a group of researchers trapped in a nearby laboratory. Given that Dan Forrester was once a Special Forces scout, he is assigned to lead a squad on this rescue mission. Upon reaching the laboratory, they find that not even the walls could stop the alien creature's bone spikes. They also discover that all the researchers have been skinned and hung upside down. The female commander instructs them to retrieve the scientific results and to be cautious and quick, as the monsters might return to the building at any moment, given they've left the bodies there. Following the commander's guidance, Dan Forrester successfully secures a sample of the alien creature. The commander then urges everyone to evacuate quickly, as bombers are en route, and the carpet bombing will begin in 6 minutes. Dan Forrester leads his team in a cautious retreat down the stairwell. The last member of the team suddenly hears a noise above. Dan Forrester turns on a light, revealing the monster's form. The sight prompts everyone to open fire, attracting even more monsters. One of the creatures leaps down, wrapping around a female team member's waist and slamming her into the railing. As they fight their way out, the monsters pursue them relentlessly, knocking the soldiers to the ground without hesitation. These creatures are incredibly tough and intelligent, even using the bony plates on their backs to block bullets. They also have several freely retractable tails that can launch deadly weapons similar to throwing knives. Its back can be described as impervious to blades and spears, while human bullets can only suppress the monster's attack but cannot kill it. The group barely escapes through the stairwell. A soldier tries to close the door but is a step too late and gets thrown out by the monster. While running away, Dan Forrester stops and turns around to provide covering fire, but a teammate is still dragged into the stairwell by the monster. Then, another monster rushes out. Dan Forrester stays behind to cover the others as they retreat, firing wildly at the monster. Even when its tentacles are shot off, the creature ignores the gunfire and continues to advance. Dan Forrester runs out of ammo for his assault rifle and switches to a pistol. Then suddenly the pistol also runs out of ammo. Fortunately, there's a fire axe on the wall. He quickly grabs the axe and swings at the alien monster, striking the floor instead, startling the monster. Dan Forrester puts more effort into it and unexpectedly stabs the monster's chin, but the monster doesn't die. At the critical moment, Dorian arrives, weapon in hand, slides in, and explodes the monster's head with 2 shots. He tells Dan Forrester, based on his experience from multiple jumps, that the monster's only weaknesses are its neck and abdomen. The group doesn't have time to chat and quickly flees the building. Behind them, the monster leader issues an order for a collective attack, and all the monsters swarm towards them, appearing on the streets. The squad receives a notification that the reconnaissance team will arrive at the rendezvous point in 1 minute, and the fighter jets will start bombing in 3 minutes. But the monsters on the streets are still chasing them. They have to not only escape from the monsters' attacks but also leave the red smoke area of the carpet bombing before the fighter jets arrive. And now, the human fighter jets have arrived, ready to commence the bombing. The squad passes through the red smoke and finally sees the 3 Humvees that have come to rescue them. Everyone cheers, but their joy lasts only a few seconds before they are stunned. These are alien beings that humans in the future cannot defeat. They are immensely strong, capable of easily flipping a 30-ton armored vehicle, and can pull humans out to tear and devour them with lightning speed, with no way to retreat. The squad has no choice but to go all out with firepower, running and shooting at the monsters as they go. However, these monsters are too smart. They are organized and disciplined and even use cars as cover to counterattack, giving the whole scene a vibe of a video game. The monsters constantly shoot bone spikes from their tails, and being hit by one usually means loss of life. At the command of the monster leader, the left and right guards split into 2 groups, attacking from both sides. A sharp bone spike shoots out from a tentacle, instantly knocking a female warrior off her feet and disrupting the squad's offensive and defensive lines, causing continuous casualties among the team members. The monster leader seizes the opportunity to attack Dan Forrester, who fires back with all his might. Just then, aerial support arrives in time, ready to bomb the city into oblivion. Dan Forrester quickly leads the remaining team members to break through, dodging the bone spikes shot by the monsters as they retreat in fire, as the fighter jets drop bombs, causing the monsters to scatter in all directions. More monsters converge on Dan Forrester's squad. They quickly climb over a fence and evacuate from above the tunnel, as the monsters swarm like a tidal wave. With the bombers about to arrive, an unexpected minor incident occurs. A soldier accidentally steps into a void and falls down, breaking his thigh. Dan Forrester, a former professional soldier, refuses to leave him behind and jumps down to rescue him, claiming, "I can't leave a comrade to die." But this also slows down the pace and even endangers the lives of others. Not only was the monster's defense strong, but its attack power was also terrifying, and soon all of them couldn't stand it. The female commander sends a message that the fighter jets are about to bomb the tunnel indiscriminately. What will they do now? Not wanting to drag the others down, the injured soldier and a female teammate choose to sacrifice themselves, opting to stay behind and defend. At the moment the bombs hit the ground, the reset plan is initiated. With the sky filled with the sound of explosions, all the monsters were obliterated, and Dan Forrester and the others were knocked unconscious by the blast wave. When they woke up again, they found themselves transferred to a military base in the future. Now, Dan Forrester's team was down to just Charlie and Dorian. The others didn't survive. During a casual conversation, they learned that Dorian would die from cancer in 6 months. However, Dorian believed that fate shouldn't decide how he dies. He would rather die on the battlefield than in a hospital bed. This wish was likely to be fulfilled because the colonel informed the trio that they would be redeployed to continue fighting. Later, Dan Forrester met the female commander at this location. Upon meeting her, Dan felt a familiar sensation and asked for her name. Then, it dawned on him that the female commander was actually his own daughter, Colonel Murray Forrester. Unexpectedly, the excellent Colonel Murray Forrester had become the highest commander of humanity 30 years later. Dan Forrester was so moved that he wanted to hug her, but his daughter sternly refused. Although he was puzzled, he was still pleased with his daughter's accomplishments. Colonel Murray Forrester told Dan Forrester that recruiting him was not out of personal sentiment but rather to have him complete a special mission. Colonel Murray Forrester showed Dan Forrester a video. The monsters they had been fighting were all males, while the video displayed a rare female. Its aggressiveness and reproductive capabilities were extremely strong, and the males would sacrifice their lives to protect it. While Dan Forrester was unconscious, they conducted experiments on the monsters using the pathogen Dan Forrester had brought back. The experiments could kill all the males, but for some reason, the female could not be poisoned. Colonel Murray Forrester hoped to find out why, so they decided to capture a female as an experimental subject. If they could develop a toxin effective against females, humanity might have a chance to eliminate the white long nail for good. Nearby, there was a monster nest with a female trapped inside. Following that, they immediately boarded a helicopter for their new mission. En route, Colonel Murray Forrester told Dan Forrester that these monsters had suddenly appeared on Earth. Even the future's advanced satellites and radar were unable to detect them, leaving their origins and the time of their arrival a mystery. They were extremely hungry, engaging in frenzied hunting every day. Apart from tiny creatures like ants and cockroaches, no other species could escape death. Even dinosaurs, had they still been alive, would have been doomed to extinction. Soon, the group arrived at the monster's nest by helicopter. For safety reasons, Dan Forrester and Colonel Murray Forrester remained in the helicopter. Soldiers descended into the monster's lair on ropes, straining to pull a sedated female monster out of the cave with ropes. Suddenly, the monster sprang out on its own, launching a furious attack on the soldiers. The female white long nail was massive and even more formidable in combat. Despite being bound by steel cables, it still managed to kill the soldiers trying to capture it. One by one, the soldiers met gruesome ends, and the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Colonel Murray Forrester instructed Dan Forrester to wait in the helicopter, then slid down the rope alone to assist. Upon landing, she immediately identified the problem: the soldiers had failed to secure the monster's tentacles. Seeing the monster grabbing a soldier and escaping into the darkness, Colonel Murray Forrester immediately ordered the soldiers outside to spray flames into another entrance. The monster, fearing the flames, was forced out and then grabbed a soldier as a hostage, sending out distress signals that attracted a large number of males from all directions. Seizing the opportunity, Colonel Murray Forrester aimed at the monster, shooting off one of its tentacles and rescuing the soldier. An assistant fired a rope, binding another of the monster's tentacles. As the monster attempted to flee into the darkness, Colonel Murray Forrester, disregarding her own safety, used her body and a shield to block it, then quickly instructed the soldiers to drag the monster into a cage. The soldiers struggled to move the creature. Then, with a roar from the monster, a dense swarm of male monsters descended. Seeing Colonel Murray Forrester in peril, Dan Forrester could no longer stand idly by. He immediately slid down the rope. As a monster charged at him, he fired while entering the cave, saw Colonel Murray Forrester being pinned down by the monster, and timely grabbed the monster's tentacle, preventing it from launching bone spikes at Colonel Murray Forrester. Suddenly, the monster turned and aimed its tentacle at Dan Forrester, intending to kill him. Colonel Murray Forrester took the opportunity to counterattack. With everyone working together, pulling and pushing, they finally managed to secure the female monster in a specially made iron cage. With no time to waste, the helicopter immediately lifted the cage and returned to the base. It was an unprecedented battle. Millions of ferocious alien creatures surged down the hillside in a frenzy. Dan Forrester and Colonel Murray Forrester were supposed to board a second helicopter, but the helicopter above them was overrun with monsters, shaking perilously before ultimately crashing right in front of them. In this critical moment, Dan Forrester and Colonel Murray Forrester had no choice but to climb aboard a Humvee. Dan Forrester took the wheel, while Colonel Murray Forrester set up a heavy machine gun, unleashing a barrage of fire without a moment's delay. The reason these creatures desperately attempted to intercept them was because humans had captured their sentinel. Fortunately, the heavy machine gun's immense power obliterated all pursuing monsters, allowing them to escape. Arriving at a safe beach, Colonel Murray Forrester immediately got out of the vehicle and fired a flare to wait for rescue. The recent ordeal reminded Colonel Murray Forrester of the past, and she expressed her dissatisfaction with Dan Forrester for risking himself to save her. Dan Forrester didn't understand. As a father, he naturally couldn't abandon his daughter. After facing life and death, the daughter finally opened up to Dan Forrester about why she had been so cold towards him. In the timeline where Colonel Murray Forrester grew up, Dan Forrester, discontent with his life, underwent a drastic change in temperament and abandoned his wife and daughter, disappearing without a trace. Not long after, he suddenly died in a car accident, and Colonel Murray Forrester only saw him for the last time in the hospital, which is why she had been unable to forgive Dan Forrester until now. Dan Forrester could hardly believe it. Could he really have become such a scoundrel? Afterwards, they switched to a helicopter and arrived at a military base built at sea, humanity's last bastion. Less than 100,000 people worldwide were now living here, making their homes on this massive ship. Aircraft carriers launched and landed fighter jets, forming the last line of defense along with battleships. While the city center housed a research base flying the flags of the 7 major nations, the base was surrounded by 2 rings of high walls, all to protect the central time travel tower. With it, people could travel between the present and the future. The captured female white long nail was transported back to the sea base. In the lab, father and daughter pretended as if their argument had never happened. The female white long nail was taken to the laboratory, where security measures included several large iron chains and a sedative administered every hour. Colonel Murray Forrester extracted the alien creature's blood, researching toxins that could subdue it. However, there were many potential toxins that could kill the white long nail, and it might require countless mutations and adjustments. Then, under the microscope, They screened for a toxin that could 100% kill the female beast. The vast base had limited resources. If there were more computers running programs and more scientists simultaneously working on and developing the toxin, the subsequent disaster might have been avoided. Dan Forrester stayed by his daughter's side throughout, slightly mending the emotional gap between them. But they didn't have much time because the next day would mark Dan Forrester's 7th day of service, after which he would automatically return to the year 2022. Colonel Murray Forrester told Dan Forrester that if she indeed found an effective toxin, she would have Dan transport it back through time travel, as humanity in the future was at a dead end. In contrast, humanity in 2022 was at its peak, with ample resources to produce the toxin and prevent the disaster from occurring. Thus, Dan Forrester would become the savior of the world and also save his own future, preventing his premature demise due to a midlife crisis. However, the cost would be the certain death of his future daughter. Dan Forrester agreed to Colonel Murray Forrester's request and made a promise. Just then, the computer displayed a 100% match index, and they immediately found the effective toxin. At that moment, the female beast queen suddenly woke up and witnessed this development. Knowing it was in danger, it became agitated and used its brainwaves to send out a distress signal. Suddenly, an alarm went off outside the base. 5 million monsters were summoned to the sea base, launching a total assault on the human stronghold. Soon, the first line of defense was about to be breached, and the base, with less than 100,000 people, faced a battle of life and death. Tens of thousands of monsters came across the sea, and not even deep sea bombs could stop their determined rescue of the Beast Queen. This was a war humanity could not win. Millions of monsters clambered over the 100-meter-high walls of the base, and dozens of drones unleashed their firepower. Despite the frantic gunfire, they were unable to inflict massive casualties on the monsters. Machine gunners atop the tower mounted heavy machine guns, firing thousands of rounds per second at the horde. Yet they couldn't halt the monsters' advance. The Beast King roared fiercely, its presence as commanding as an arrow piercing the clouds. Leading a vast army, it climbed up from the base's spine buried in the sea, attacking humanity's last line of defense. Despite the full-scale combat capabilities on land, sea, and air, the monsters broke through the defenses. Colonel Murray Forrester, realizing the situation was out of control, prepared for evacuation. Dan Forrester wanted to poison the female Beast King before leaving, but there was only a little toxin left, which couldn't be wasted on it. It had to be taken back to 2022 by Dan Forrester. Colonel Murray Forrester's primary mission now was to protect her father for these short 8 minutes. After 8 minutes, Dan Forrester would automatically be transported back. Thus, Colonel Murray Forrester ordered her subordinates to protect the time machine at all costs, while she and Dan Forrester headed to the rooftop, planning to wait out the countdown in a helicopter. A monster lieutenant, guided by the Beast King's brainwaves, broke into the lab to find the female Beast King. Together, they bit through the chains binding it. Known for her volatile temper, its first act upon being freed was to seek vengeance, tracking by scent. It demonstrated not just high intelligence but also an understanding of military tactics. He immediately calls out to the other monsters and surrounds Dan Forrester, and the two of them are forced to fight back to back. With a loud shout from Dan Forrester, Colonel Murray Forrester shot a gas pipeline, severely injuring the female Beast King. They then fired while retreating, eventually breaking through the encirclement. The time tower had begun its warm-up, and Dan Forrester was scheduled to be sent back to 2022 in 4 minutes. As they ran towards the helicopter, Colonel Murray Forrester was unfortunately struck by a bone spike from the female Beast King and fell heavily to the ground. Dan Forrester immediately turned and fired, driving back the Beast King. Meanwhile, countless monsters surrounded the helipad. The helicopter had to take off and leave, with the pilot instructing them to meet at another helipad. Dan Forrester, supporting Colonel Murray Forrester, made way to the helipad with difficulty. Unfortunately, the last bastion could no longer withstand the monster onslaught. The monsters flooded in like a tidal wave, rendering the base's firearms ineffective, and the base was completely overrun. A cruise ship, out of control, crashed into the military platform, causing a fire and a massive explosion that led to the crash of the fleeing helicopters, obliterating any hope of escape. Colonel Murray Forrester stopped running and simply slumped to the ground, with less than a minute until Dan Forrester would be automatically transported back, and with Colonel Murray Forrester unable to move, she tearfully bid Dan Forrester goodbye. She handed Dan Forrester the bottle of toxin, imploring him to survive and return to prevent the disaster. As they shared this poignant moment, the female Beast King, relentless, found them again. However, the explosion of the cruise ship caused a chain reaction that tilted the platform, and Colonel Murray Forrester slipped and fell. Dan Forrester reacted quickly, grabbing Colonel Murray Forrester's hand. With 20 seconds left until the jump back, Colonel Murray Forrester, relieved, let go of her hand and fell. Below, a group of hungry white long nails waited for her. Dan Forrester, losing his reason, jumped after her, but in the next second, he disappeared, transported back to 2022 along with the rest of his team. Even in an unconscious state, he tightly clutched the alien toxin. The enigmatic time travel machine closed its passage, preventing humanity from using the time machine to return to 30 years in the future. Thus, humanity's battle with the alien creatures ended in defeat. Dan Forrester found that Charlie had also survived. Charlie admitted to hiding rather than defending the base, for which he felt guilty. Though Dan Forrester only stayed in the future for 7 days, it felt like an entirely different world. The experience had changed him completely. Back home, he saw his 7-year-old daughter again, but he couldn't feel happy. His heart troubled for a long time. That night, unable to sleep, he shared everything with his wife, expressing that although he now had the toxin, he didn't know how to use it because the exact time and place of the monster's arrival on Earth were unknown. All that was known was that the first attack occurred in Russia in 2048. The problem was, no spacecraft had been found, and satellite radar had detected no traces, making it impossible to prevent their arrival in advance. His wife suggested that just because the monsters attacked in 2048 didn't mean they arrived on Earth that year. They might have landed on Earth much earlier, hiding in some desolate part of Russia. Unbeknownst to humans, at that moment, Dan Forrester realized he might have a way to determine the time and place. Dan Forrester sought out Dorian, recalling that during his time in the future world, he had cut off a claw from a white long nail to make a necklace. They took the claw for analysis and discovered it was covered in volcanic ash. Interestingly, the ash wasn't from Russia but from areas around China and North Korea. Dan Forrester had a student who was a volcanic enthusiast. From him, they learned that 946 years ago, the Changbai Mountain on the China-North Korea border experienced the largest volcanic eruption in history, its force exceeding that of 1,000 nuclear bombs. The ash from this eruption spread across the world, and even today, beneath the northern glaciers of Russia, remnants of that volcanic ash can still be unearthed. This indicated that the white long nails might have dug through the ice, picking up the volcanic ash on their claws. This explained why satellites failed to spot them initially. They emerged from beneath the ice, meaning they had always been on Earth. The reason for their resurgence 1,000 years ago could be due to environmental degradation and global warming, which led to the melting of glaciers, awakening the long-dormant creatures. With a likely source pinpointed, Dan Forrester decided to head to the snowy mountains of Russia, aiming to eliminate the monsters before they could appear. However, Dodd, citing concerns over spending taxpayers' money, outright refused. Since the destruction of the Time Tower, humanity had lost its connection to the future. With the belief that a cataclysm was impending in 30 years, the world became chaotic. Dodd was in a high state of alert, with disturbances already occurring at the borders. It was considered fortunate that humans weren't fighting amongst themselves before the arrival of the extraterrestrial creatures. Without concrete evidence, Dodd refused to authorize a covert operation in a hostile nation. Left with no other choice, Dan Forrester turned to his estranged father, who happened to own an airplane and was a fearless pilot. Dan Forrester then assembled his own team, produced as much toxin as possible, and, with his father and LT Hart piloting, set off on their mission. The team quickly reached their destination, riding snowmobiles and searching for areas with magnetic anomalies. After some searching, all of their snowmobile detectors malfunctioned, indicating something unusual beneath the glacier. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a large snow pit. After blasting through, the ice layer sank, revealing an entrance. The group followed the entrance deep into the cave, eventually finding themselves hundreds of meters beneath the ice layer, following an underground river until they located the nest of the white long nails and, indeed, an alien spaceship that had been on Earth for thousands of years. It turned out that the white long nails had arrived on Earth aboard this ship over 1,000 years ago, effortlessly cutting through the spaceship capable of interstellar travel. With limited manpower and ammunition, Dan Forrester decided to brave the alien creature's lair with just a few of them, intending to exterminate the extraterrestrial beings. He left his father and Dorian to guard the entrance, not considering the possibility that their failure could hasten humanity's destruction. Soon, they found the cockpit, where 2 alien bodies were discovered, revealing that the true owners of the ship were not the white long nails. It appeared the spaceship didn't land normally but had crash-landed on Earth, with the aliens dying in the cockpit. Through continuous exploration, they discovered a chamber full of dormant creatures. It turns out, the alien beings known as white spikes, which appeared 30 years later, were cargo of extraterrestrials. These creatures were either livestock for breeding or, in essence, an extraterrestrial biochemical weapon designed to eradicate wars on planets. classified as a planet-destroying weapon. However, the accidental crash of the spaceship suggests that Earth was not the intended target for these aliens. 1,000 years ago, Earth was still in the era of cold weapons, and ancient civilizations worshipped the natural world. Respecting nature, Dan Forrester decided to eliminate them, acting as if these beings had never passed by Earth. He and his team quickly took out syringes and injected the brought toxin into the white spikes, initiating a counter-predatory battle of revenge. The toxin worked rapidly. In no time, the creatures were howling in agony, turning into piles of rotten flesh. The ship also harbored numerous monster embryos. Sensing the crisis, this highlighted the importance of manpower. If there had been more people to inject all the creatures simultaneously, the others wouldn't have been awakened by the screams. Soon, the white long nails next to them were breaking free from the cultivation pods, and everyone could only shoot at them. But as a result, a few of them still took advantage of the chaos and escaped. Dan Forrester's father and Charlie couldn't hold them off at the door. What were they to do? The ones that just awakened are just some of them. There's a ship full of monsters waiting to awaken. So if we make the toxins into toxin bullets, we might be able to handle it. The only solution now was to destroy the entire ship. Dorian and others decided to stay behind and set up explosives inside the ship, while Dan Forrester pursued the escaped white long spikes. Once the millennia-old white long spikes escaped, they adapted to Earth's atmosphere without needing to recover, immediately entering a mode of slaughter. Charlie and Dan Forrester's father outside hastily attacked, but Charlie's gun jammed. In a critical moment, he used a cutting machine. The monster, unable to stop in time, collided head-on with the saw, eliminating the escaped creatures. However, the largest female beast king escaped. When Dan Forrester came out to assist, he learned they were pursuing the one that got away. Dorian and the others were sniping at the creatures inside the ship. However, upon entering, they found the entire ship's monsters had awakened. Despite retreating and attacking, they couldn't stop the massive wave of creatures coming at them. In desperation, Dorian decided to detonate the prepared explosives, burying the ship and its full load of monsters under the glacier, finally achieving his desired end. Only the three outside the ship survived, along with the escaped female beast king. The priority was to find it quickly and exterminate it. Should it escape and reproduce, it would pose an eternal threat to humanity. They rode snowmobiles, chasing the female beast king, following its tracks until they found it. The beast king, thinking it had found food, charged at Dan Forrester's father. However, it ran into a decoy trap set up by the elder, who then shot it in the head. Despite its ferocity, the elder's shot seemed merely to itch the beast king. As the beast king charged at the elder, Dan Forrester appeared on a snowmobile, knocking it over. Then, father and son shot at it from both sides, putting the beast king in a dire situation. However, as they fought, the beast king suddenly vanished, lost in the blizzard. Back to back, they searched for the beast king, which suddenly leaped out, sending them flying with its tentacles. They hurriedly fired back, but their firepower was clearly insufficient to suppress the Beast King. The Beast King quickly shot a bone spike, knocking Dan Forrester's handgun away, and then hit his thigh with another. As Dan Forrester fell, the Beast King charged madly. Dan Forrester's pulled out the spike and stabbed the Beast King in the eye. The father then blinded the Beast King's other eye. Enraged, the Beast King shot bone spikes wildly. Seizing the opportunity, Dan Forrester injected the toxin into the Beast King's tentacle, quickly taking effect. Thinking the battle was over, they were shocked when the Beast King bit off its own arm to stop the toxin spread, showing a fierce will to survive. After a snowy battle, the blind Beast King could only rely on its sense of smell to locate Dan Forrester, practically defenseless. Yet, the father, in a sudden bold move, intended to lure the Beast King with his blood to fall off a cliff together, ready to sacrifice heroically. Dan Forrester disagreed. Empowered by familial bonds, he fought heroically, managing to dodge the Beast King's attacks as if he were Star-Lord from the Avengers, eventually overwhelming it. After a series of punches, they forced the toxin down the Beast King's throat, incapable of resistance. The female Beast King began to rot immediately upon the toxin taking effect. Dan Forrester kicked it off a cliff, where it smashed into pieces on a rock below. Humanity finally averted the crisis of being consumed in the future. Dan Forrester and his father reconciled and reunited. The story ends with the Forrester family together again, though many questions remain unanswered, such as the origins of the aliens. For more captivating stories and the answers to these mysteries, subscribe to my channel. See you in the next episode.